On January 18, 1943, the United States government banned sliced bread. Not bread, sliced bread. The directive came from the Food Distribution Administration, and it was, on its face, a practical wartime measure. Slicing machines used steel. Pre-sliced loaves required heavier wax paper wrapping to keep the exposed surfaces from drying out. Steel and wax paper were needed elsewhere. The math was straightforward. What happened next was not. Within days, American housewives were writing letters to newspapers in tones usually reserved for genuine emergencies. One letter to the New York Times, printed February 1943, described the ban as the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard of. The writer was not alone. The mail volume to government offices was significant enough that officials took notice. The ban lasted less than 3 months. On March 8, 1943, it was quietly lifted. The official explanation cited improved conservation methods. The actual explanation was simpler. The American public had decided that pre-sliced commercial bread was not a convenience, it was a necessity, and the government backed down. That reaction tells you something important, not about the war and not about wax paper. It tells you that by 1943, commercial bread had already been handed over to the factory so completely that even a temporary inconvenience felt like a deprivation. The average American household was not baking its own bread in 1943. It hadn't been for years. The factory had the bread. The factory had always had the bread as far as most people were concerned. What this video is about is what the factory did with it next.
Wonder Bread launched in 1921. Sliced bread arrived commercially in 1928, introduced by the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri using a machine invented by Otto Rohwedder. By the mid-1930s, regional and national baking companies were supplying the majority of bread consumed in urban and suburban American households. The neighborhood baker was already losing ground. The industrial loaf was already winning. But here is what most people don't know about that early industrial loaf. It still tasted like bread. Not because industrial bakers were more principled than they would later become, because the process hadn't changed yet. Early commercial bread, from the 1920s through the mid-1950s, was still made using bulk fermentation. The scale was industrial, the equipment was modern, but the bread still sat. Yeast consumed sugars over 4 to 6 hours, produced carbon dioxide to leaven the dough, and generated something the industry would later spend decades trying to replicate artificially: organic acids, alcohols, and the flavor compounds that give bread its complexity: lactic acid, acetic acid, esters and aldehydes that accumulate slowly and cannot be rushed. The early factory loaf shared this process with every loaf that had ever been baked at home. It just happened in larger vessels. That bread went stale in 2 or 3 days. It was sold within a limited radius from the bakery because it had to be. It contained flour, water, yeast, salt, and maybe a small amount of sugar or shortening. The ingredient list was short enough to read in 10 seconds. The government looked at it in 1941 and decided something was still wrong. The trigger was the draft. When the United States began mobilizing for the Second World War, the physical examinations of incoming recruits revealed a pattern that alarmed military planners and public health officials alike. Large numbers of young American men showed signs of nutritional deficiency. The specific deficiencies pointed back to diet. The diet pointed back to bread, specifically to what industrial milling had removed from it. White flour was produced by stripping the wheat kernel down to the starchy endosperm. The bran and the germ, where most of the fiber, the fat-soluble vitamins, the minerals, and the B vitamins lived, were removed in the milling process. What remained was structurally stable, resistant to spoilage, and nutritionally incomplete in ways that had accumulated across a generation of Americans eating it as a staple. The FDA's response was the enrichment program. Beginning in 1941, with wartime regulations making it effectively mandatory by 1943,
Commercial bread was required to have four nutrients added back: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron. The enrichment program was presented as a solution. What it actually was is better understood as a partial correction. Think of it this way. Industrial milling removed roughly 20 dozen nutritionally significant components from whole wheat. The enrichment program put back four. The fiber stayed gone, vitamin E stayed gone, magnesium, zinc, and the full range of B vitamins beyond the mandated three stayed gone. The bread was enriched in the specific sense that four things were returned. In every other sense, it was still the stripped product it had been before. The difference was that now the label said enriched, and the problem was considered addressed. It wasn't. But the government didn't look again, and by the time it might have, the bread had become something different in ways that had nothing to do with milling. The post-war supermarket changed what bread needed to be. In 1950, there were roughly 50,000 independent retail bakeries operating in the United States. These were neighborhood operations. They baked daily, sold locally, and their bread was consumed within a day or two because there was no practical alternative. The bread was fresh or it was wasted. That constraint was also a quality guarantee, though nobody thought of it in those terms at the time. The supermarket model broke that constraint. It also made it irrelevant. A regional supermarket chain in 1955 didn't want daily bread deliveries from 50 neighborhood bakeries. It wanted one supplier, one standardized product, consistent sizing for the shelving system, uniform packaging for the display case, and a shelf life measured in weeks rather than days. It wanted bread that could leave a central baking facility in Ohio on a Monday and still be sellable in a grocery store in Pennsylvania on a Friday. The neighborhood baker who baked at 6 in the morning and sold out by noon could not provide any of that. The industrial baking company that could guarantee a 14-day shelf life could. The neighborhood bakery didn't lose because its bread was worse. In every organoleptic sense, flavor, texture, aroma, it was better. It lost because its bread didn't travel. And in the post-war American grocery economy, bread that didn't travel didn't have a future. What this meant in practical terms was that the industrial baker's primary engineering challenge had shifted. The question was no longer how to make bread people wanted to eat. It was how to make bread that could survive the supply chain. Those are genuinely different problems. The first one is solved by process. The second one is solved by chemistry. And the chemistry was coming. But before the chemistry arrived, something happened that the chemistry was designed to hide.
There were women who never stopped baking. In the 1950s and into the 1960s, as the supermarket model consolidated its hold on American grocery life, a specific and identifiable population of American households was still producing bread at home. They were not a majority. The industrial loaf had been dominant since the 1930s, and by 1955, home bread baking was practiced by a minority concentrated in particular communities and circumstances. Rural households, where the nearest grocery store was a meaningful distance away and the economics of home baking still made sense. Recent immigrant communities, Italian, Eastern European, Jewish, where specific bread traditions were tied to cultural identity in ways that made substitution feel like a different kind of loss. Lower-income urban households where a woman's labor was cheaper than a commercial loaf, and individual women distributed across every region and income level who had learned from their mothers and their grandmothers and saw no reason to stop. What they were preserving, without necessarily framing it this way, was a process. Long fermentation, a starter or a sponge left to develop overnight, dough that was handled twice and rested between, loaves that went into an oven that had been heated for 20 minutes before the bread arrived. None of this was mysticism. It was technique accumulated across generations, passed through demonstration rather than written instruction, and maintained not out of sentiment, but because it produced a result that the commercial loaf, even at its 1950s best, did not fully replicate. The bread tasted different, not better in some abstract evaluative sense. different in specific, identifiable ways, more complex, slightly acidic in a way that wasn't sharp but was present, a crust that had structural integrity rather than giving way immediately, a crumb that dried rather than molded, staled rather than collapsed, and lasted 3 days on the counter rather than growing soft and then green. The women who baked this bread were not producing an artisanal product. They were producing what bread had always been before the factory found reasons to change it. In San Francisco, the sourdough tradition survived as something close to a regional institution. The specific lactobacillus culture native to the Bay Area produced a flavor profile distinct enough from commercial bread that it had become a local identity marker. Boudin Bakery had been producing sourdough using a continuously maintained starter since 1849. That starter was not a recipe, it was a living system, a culture of microorganisms producing the acids and compounds that no commercial additive had successfully reproduced. The sourdough tradition survived in San Francisco, not because the city was sentimental about bread, but because the product was different enough from what the factory made that the market for it never fully collapsed. Elsewhere, the tradition was quieter. The Amish and Mennonite communities maintained traditional baking practices as a matter of principle, not nostalgia, not resistance to modernity, but a commitment to a way of living in which bread made with time and a short ingredient list was simply what bread was. In Italian immigrant neighborhoods in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, women were still producing loaves whose process traced back to village bakeries in Campania and Sicily. In Jewish households in every major American city, challah and rye and pumpernickel were still being produced by hand by women who regarded the commercial versions as edible but not quite right. None of this was enough to constitute a counterculture. It was too dispersed, too quiet, too embedded in specific ethnic and geographic context to register as a movement or a resistance. It was simply what some people still did, while most people had already stopped. The science that would later explain why their bread tasted and performed differently was not yet mainstream consumer knowledge in the 1950s and 1960s. The research on phytic acid, an anti-nutrient present in wheat that binds minerals including iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium and reduces their absorption, and on what long fermentation does to it, was not something most people had encountered. Phytic acid is neutralized substantially by the enzyme phytase, which is activated and sustained during long fermentation. A bread made with a 4-hour bulk ferment or an overnight sourdough process contains meaningfully less phytic acid than a bread made with rapid rise commercial yeast or no fermentation at all. The minerals are more available. The bread is more nutritious in a specific biochemical sense that has nothing to do with what the enrichment program was measuring. The women who kept baking didn't know this. They knew the bread was better. They had a feel for it that preceded any formal articulation of why. And when the industrial loaf's process changed in the late 1950s, when the fermentation disappeared entirely from the factory, they were the only people left who had anything to compare it to. The continuous dough-making process arrived in American commercial bakeries in the late 1950s and was in widespread industrial use by the mid-1960s. To understand what it changed, you have to understand what it replaced. Traditional bread, including the early industrial loaf, was made in stages. Flour and water and yeast were combined and left to ferment in bulk for several hours. During that time, yeast consumed simple sugars and produced carbon dioxide, which created the gas bubbles that made the bread rise. But fermentation also produced everything else: the lactic and acetic acids, the alcohols, the flavor compounds that accumulated slowly and were the difference between bread that tasted complex and bread that tasted nothing in particular. Fermentation was not an ingredient, it was a biological event. It transformed the raw material into something chemically distinct from what went in. British food industry made the same transition at almost exactly the same time. The Chorleywood bread process
developed in 1961 at the British Baking Industries Research Association in Hertfordshire, applied the same logic. Mechanical dough development, chemical oxidation, eliminated fermentation. British food historians have since described Chorleywood as one of the most consequential undisclosed changes to the national food supply in the 20th century. The American shift was contemporaneous and comparably consequential, and it received even less public notice.
The ingredient changes followed the process change, and they followed logically. Once the fermentation was gone, the bread's natural flavor had to come from somewhere. It didn't come from chemistry, not convincingly, not yet. So what emerged was a product whose flavor profile was flatter and simpler than the industrial loaf it had replaced. The emulsifiers arrived. Monoglycerides and diglycerides, derived largely from soy, were added to retain moisture and prevent the crumb from drying and firming over time. They replaced what fermentation had naturally contributed to crumb structure. DATEM, diacetyl tartaric acid ester of monoglycerides, followed, along with sodium steroloyl lactylate, both designed to maintain texture through extended refrigerated distribution cycles. Calcium propionate entered the formula as a mold inhibitor. A loaf that had previously gone stale within 2 or 3 days, staling being a natural process driven by starch retrograding, was now required to resist mold for 2 weeks. Staling and molding are different processes. Staling was slowed by the emulsifiers. Molding was prevented by the calcium propionate. Together, they produced a loaf that sat on the counter for 2 weeks and remained soft and visually unchanged in ways that no naturally fermented bread had ever done, because naturally fermented bread contained acids that inhibited mold through a biological mechanism rather than a chemical additive. The sourdough loaf resists mold because its pH is low enough to make the environment hostile. The commercial loaf resists mold because something in the formula kills it. The result looks the same. The mechanism is entirely different. The dough conditioners followed. Potassium bromate strengthens gluten structure, allows faster processing, and produces a higher, whiter loaf with better oven spring. It entered wide commercial use in American bread production in the post-war decades and remained in standard use through the 1980s and beyond. In 1991, the FDA reviewed the available evidence on potassium bromate and issued guidance recommending that commercial bakers voluntarily phase it out. The concern was carcinogenicity. The International Agency for Research on Cancer had classified it as a possible human carcinogen. The FDA's guidance was not a ban, it was a recommendation. More than 30 years later, potassium bromate is still in use in American commercial baking. California requires a cancer warning label on products containing it. The other 49 states do not. Azodicarbamide, ADA, is an oxidizing agent used to speed gluten development and bleach flour. It is approved by the FDA at up to 45 parts per million. It is banned in the European Union and Australia. It received significant public attention in 2014 when Subway was pressured to remove it from its bread formulation. The coverage described it as a chemical used in yoga mat production, which was accurate in the specific sense that the same compound has industrial applications in foamed plastics, and distracting in the sense that chemical compounds regularly serve multiple industrial purposes without that fact being relevant to their safety in food. What is relevant is that ADA breaks down during baking into byproducts that include semicarbazide, which has shown carcinogenic effects in animal studies. The human evidence is not conclusive. The FDA's position is that it is safe at approved levels. The EU and Australia reached a different conclusion. Each of these additives solved a real specific problem. Calcium propionate solved mold in a product that needed to survive 2 weeks of distribution. Emulsifiers solved texture drift in a crumb that no longer had fermentation to maintain its structure. Dough conditioners solved processing speed and gluten consistency in a high-volume industrial operation.
If you map the ingredient list against the logistics requirements of the supermarket supply chain, every entry would have a corresponding line item in the distribution budget. The ingredient list is not random. It is the supply chain expressed in chemistry. The average commercial bread loaf in the United States today contains between 20 and 30 ingredients. A loaf baked at home from a standard recipe contains 5 or 6. The government has not looked closely at the cumulative formula since 1943. The enrichment program is still in effect, unchanged in its essential terms for more than 80 years. The same 4 nutrients, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron, are still being added back to white flour. The fiber is still gone, the vitamin E is still gone, the magnesium and zinc and the rest of the B vitamin spectrum are still gone. The enrichment was a partial fix applied to a partial diagnosis, and it has been grandfathered forward through every subsequent change to the product without revision. The CDM process is still the industry standard. The fermentation is still gone from commercial bread production. The potassium bromate recommendation, issued in 1991, is still unenforced. The commercial bread market in the United States is dominated by 3 companies. The neighborhood bakery population that stood at roughly 50,000 in 1950 has declined to a fraction of that, concentrated in urban areas and largely serving a premium market that charges $4 to $7 for a loaf, made the way all bread was made before the supply chain required otherwise. The artisan bread revival of the 1980s and 1990s was, in structural terms, the market discovering a gap. Bakers like Steve Sullivan at Acme Bread in Berkeley, Chad Robertson in San Francisco, and the network of craft bakers that spread through American cities in the following decades were not producing a nostalgic product. They were the women who kept baking through the 1950s and 1960s in rural kitchens, in immigrant households, in the homes of women who had learned from their mothers and saw no practical reason to stop, were not doing something artisanal. They were doing something ordinary. They were making bread the way bread had always been made, with time as an ingredient, because time was what produced the result. They were not ahead of their time. They were simply not behind it yet. What Grandma baked was not better because she was more skilled or more careful or more devoted to craft. It was better because nobody had yet found a compelling enough economic reason to change it. The process was intact. The fermentation was intact. The ingredient list was short because nothing had yet arrived in the supply chain demanding that it grow longer. The factory found those reasons. It found them in the supermarket contract and the distribution radius and the 14-day shelf life and the cost per loaf calculation that made the CDM process irresistible. Each reason was real. Each decision was rational. The cumulative result was a product that wore the name of bread and had been quietly re-engineered over roughly 20 years into something that shared a shape with what it had replaced and almost nothing else. The process was the product. When the process went, the product went with it. The name stayed.